You're listening to Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. O'Brien Communications is a corporate communications consultancy that can be found at o'briencommunications.com. To connect with us at Shaping Opinion, go to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you enjoy the podcast, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. When you rate and review on iTunes, you help more listeners like you find us. Do you remember the first time that you learned about hydraulic fracturing?
Certainly. I've been in the industry for, 37 years. So, it's been part of my life since, I began my professional career back in 1983. So I'm certainly aware of hydraulic fracturing and learned quickly that hydraulic fracturing began here in Pennsylvania in the mid-1940s.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by David Spigelmyer. He's the president of the Marcellus Shale Coalition, a leading trade association dedicated to shale gas development. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with David about the myths and realities surrounding shale gas and America's energy future. The 1970s and early 1980s were a dire time for many mill towns from around the Great Lakes and into Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The region was home to America's steel and automotive production. These industries were in no small way responsible for America's rise on the global stage to superpower status. But by the 1970s, the region saw a sharp decline in industrial work as many factories were closed and abandoned and left to rust on acres of unused real estate, while the people who used to work there looked for work. Local news reports of increasing home foreclosure rates were on the rise, along with declining populations in once thriving towns and cities. Foreign steelmakers and automakers drove down wages and prices on the global market. The way manufacturing had been done up until that point wasn't working anymore. In 1983, unemployment in the Pittsburgh market alone hit 15%. Nearby communities saw unemployment rise to 27%. In the region, the number of those unemployed hit 212,000, and this is just one region. One by one, steel mills closed, and with each one closing, 2,000 to 8,000 people were out of work, many for good. There were pickets and protests, labor strikes, and in the end, silence. The region became known as the Rust Belt. Former working-class towns fell into decline. Young generations knew they would not find work in the mill like their parents, so they left town and local communities fell apart. Pittsburgh was one of the more prominent big cities to feel the impact of the decline of big steel. While the city and the region worked hard to reinvent itself over decades, shedding its smoky milltown image for a new economy, one based on technology, biotech, and healthcare, the lack of good manufacturing jobs is one problem that never really went away. The news wasn't much better for the energy industry in Texas around the same time. Energy industry experts saw what they said were irreversible declines in hydrocarbon energy supplies, oil and gas. The country became increasingly dependent on foreign sources of oil and gas and had to pay high prices set by cartels, which contributed to higher costs for daily items, such as groceries and utilities. That's when an oil man named George Mitchell took on a long-term effort to see if those experts were wrong. Mitchell needed to find new sources of energy. He was already sending large amounts of natural gas from his Texas fields to the city of Chicago. This was his main source of revenue. But as his fields started to dry up, he was worried about his company's and his own future. Through the 1980s and 1990s, he drilled all over Texas to see for himself. He used existing technologies to start to fracture shale rock formations in fields where he had already pumped out the oil and gas. He felt he had to find gas somewhere, some way on his fields. Bigger companies like Exxon and Chevron had already shut down their operations in the same area, but Mitchell was undeterred. His team started to experiment with fluids and mixtures that they were using, and they started to find that thinner, watery mixtures were more effective at breaking the shale rock apart, and that released the natural gas inside. It took him 17 years, but by 1998, George Mitchell opened up a natural gas well that had a flow so big that industry experts didn't believe it at first. 3 years later, George Mitchell sold his company for $3.5 billion. In the course of this, Mitchell developed a process that tapped the natural gas reserves that previously were unreachable, and it would revolutionize America's energy industry and revitalize some of those old mill towns that still had never fully recovered in the Rust Belt. In 1998, unbeknownst to George and everyone who lived in the Rust Belt, they were sitting on top of one of the largest natural gas formations in the world that could only be tapped through the process George developed in the 1990s. The first natural gas well that was drilled in the Marcellus formation was in 2003, but it wasn't until 2008 that production increased dramatically through the use of hydraulic fracturing. David, would you mind telling us a little bit about the Marcellus Shale field?
Sure. Here in Pennsylvania, it's 33 of our 67 counties. It's to the west of the Allegheny Thrust, and it's been a game changer in terms of energy supply for not only our Commonwealth, but our nation and now the globe. I mean, we're able to today take natural gas that's produced here in Pennsylvania, turn that into job opportunities that are beginning to grow across not only Pennsylvania, but across the country. I think back in 2008, we were about 60% dependent on foreign sources of energy. Today, the Energy Information Administration out of the Department of Energy has predicted that we will be energy independent by 2020. What an enormous opportunity and benefit for our country in a short period of time. And when I was talking about opportunities globally, we now have the ability to cryogenically freeze natural gas, move it in ships abroad, and potentially tackle the issue of global energy poverty. Nations that don't have electricity 24/7 like we have here in Pennsylvania and across our country, and we get used to the fact that we turn our lights on, we hit the switch, the lights come on, or we plug our toaster in that our toast is cooked. In other parts of the country or other parts of the world, frankly, that doesn't happen. A lot of folks, 3 billion people across our planet, go to the switch and there's no power there. So natural gas has the ability to electrify the world and do it in an environmentally responsible fashion.
You mentioned shipping gas through ship, and I think that's one of the things that helps people understand actually what we're talking about in terms of the volume. When we talk about the volume of gas underfoot in the Marcellus region, and you look at maybe trucks or shipping containers, can you estimate roughly how many ships, how many trucks it would take to carry all of that gas to the rest of the world?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a number of ships or the number of trucks, but I would tell you that back in 2008, we produced about a quarter of Pennsylvania's natural gas supply through our conventional fleet of about 4,000 wells being drilled annually in Pennsylvania, and we had about almost 80,000 of those wells in production. Today, we've got about 10,800 wells that have been drilled unconventionally or horizontally. We have about 85 or 8,800 of those wells in production. And today we're producing in Pennsylvania alone about 6 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which is about 22% of our nation's natural gas supply. And then you start to add the supply of Ohio and West Virginia, also part of the Marcellus. And a quarter of the nation's natural gas supply is being met from this region. Back to the question, how many trucks would it take? I mean, let's face it, the safest form of energy transportation is pipeline. That needs to be done in an environmentally responsible fashion. We work on that every day. It's the blocking and tackling for our industry. It needs to be done in an environmental responsible fashion so that the benefits, environmental benefits, the energy benefits can be achieved for our nation. And that's exactly what's happening today. Again, we need to make sure the rules are in place, and our coalition has worked hard to modernize the regulatory framework for development to make sure it gets done correctly.
Well, I know that we can't really go on without finding out more about the Marcellus Shale Coalition, because you're a leading organization not only on Marcellus issues, but shale gas issues. Can you describe what the coalition is, what it does, and who it represents?
Yeah, we're now a decade-old trade association that represents not only the upstream producers, or the folks that are actually drilling for natural gas, but we also represent the pipelines that gather and deliver that gas to consumers, as well as utilities that do the same. And, a large part of our membership is comprised of hundreds of companies that are supply chain businesses that support our industry every single day to make this all possible. Those are our neighbors, people that live in our communities, that are our Little League coaches and our scout leaders, and are active in our communities every day, that also share the same things that we share to make sure it gets done correctly here in the Commonwealth.
Well, there's a term that everybody kind of may be familiar with, but they may not actually know what it is, and that is fracking, or hydraulic fracturing. And I know that the process uses water, chemical injections, and they do this basically to access the gas that's locked deep inside the earth. But can you describe exactly, technically, what the process is and how it works?
Sure. First of all, it's primarily about 99.5% water and sand, and another 0.5% chemical base to be able to suspend sand in water. I mean, if you put water into a beaker and then dump sand will all go to the bottom. So we use a chemical additive to suspend sand. We also use a biocide agent to kill any bacteria. I mean, we're talking about drilling 8,000 feet under the Earth's crust. It's warm there. Bacteria grow. So we use a bacterial agent to kill that bacteria. And we use an agent that basically keeps calcification or scaling from happening on the pipes that are there. The process of casing a well has been modernized dramatically in Pennsylvania, so it's not just a single borehole that goes into the ground. We put what they call a conductor pipe on the ground, which serves as a foundation for the development of a well. That's usually in excess of 20 inches in diameter. That hole's drilled to about 100 feet in depth, and then it's cemented in place. Much like a plunger, it will push cement down the center part of the pipe and force it back up what they call the annular space, or outside that pipe. So you're about 100 feet deep. We go in and then put a surface casing piece of pipe in place that goes anywhere from 800 to 1,000 feet to depth. Everyone in this region knows that our fresh groundwater aquifers in Pennsylvania are anywhere from 100 feet to 500 feet, but normally a surface casing will go 800 to 1,000 feet. That's cemented into place as well, again, primarily to protect our fresh groundwater. In Pennsylvania, back in 2009, we agreed to add another piece of redundant protective casing called intermediate casing. Usually goes anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 feet in depth, and that too is then cemented in place to protect fresh groundwater. And then drilling pipe goes then to full depth. In the case of the Marcellus, it's usually between 7,000 and 8,000 feet in depth, and we need about 1,200 feet to be able to turn that drill bit horizontally. The change today in drilling is that we can actually drill several miles of development off a single pad because of the ability to be able to turn a drill bit horizontally and produce far more gas than we ever thought possible with conventional technology. And I think if we were in front and could show a schematic, just think about the fact that if you penetrate a strata, the underground crust of the earth, vertically, you only penetrate that small portion of the strata that you interface. Now being able to turn that drill bit horizontally, you can go, we have laterals in this basin that are 18 or 20,000 feet in length. The average probably is 8 to 10,000 feet today. So that's almost 2 miles of development, and it's been game changing. I think I mentioned a few moments ago that there were 4,000 wells drilled annually. I think last year we drilled about 800 wells, and about 8,800 wells are in production here in Pennsylvania, and we're producing 6 trillion cubic feet. Again, 23% of America's natural gas, and 10 years ago, we barely met a quarter of Pennsylvania's demand with the type of production that we were doing, with a lot of wells being drilled every year.
One of the things you mentioned that I think a lot of people may not understand is when you mention using concrete to protect the water table. And I think what people may not understand is they have this idea that there's this drill bit that just goes right into the ground, and whatever it digs up comes up out of that hole. But what they don't realize is that concrete is used first to create this tube that goes through the water table, so that when a drill bit actually goes through the concrete tube, it never comes in contact with the water. The water is protected almost like a swimming pool would be if there was a tube going through the pool and down underneath the swimming pool and then accessing the gas. So the gas never actually goes through the water. The drill bit never actually comes in contact with the water. None of that happens because there's this barrier, this concrete barrier between the drilling process and the water table. Isn't that true?
Yeah, Tim, that's exactly the case. And I think you'll find if a person wanted to reach out to the Department of Environmental Protection and ask the question about hydraulic fracturing fluids, the fact that the well casing standards are what they are today, we haven't had a single case of where hydraulic fracturing fluids have got into fresh groundwater because of the protective measures taken. What is often confused for groundwater contamination is the fact that our upper crust in Pennsylvania in particular is loaded with methane. Our subsurface, coals are full of methane, and our shallow aquifers in many cases have free methane in them long before we ever drill a well. So we do sampling of fresh groundwater and water wells before we ever drill a well, one, to get baseline analysis. And today in certain areas of the Commonwealth, we found that 1 in 4 water wells have some level of free methane in them before we ever drill. So making sure the cement's in place and cased properly is absolutely important to make sure that there's no methane movement into fresh groundwater, and that remains a really important part of what we do in terms of protective measures taken when we drill a natural gas well in the Commonwealth.
Well, we just touched on one of the big environmental risks, and there are a few risks, and they are risks, but it doesn't mean that they're not addressed. And I think that's one of the other myths is people feel that there's a risk and they don't realize how much attention is not only being addressed by on the part of the people who do the drilling and the exploration, the people that put the pipelines together, but also by the DEP and by which is the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, or the EPA. Fracking uses waters and chemicals, and it transports the gas. So as a result of that, there are air emissions concerns. Can you describe some of the water issues, the things that people are most concerned about when they worry about how fracking is going to affect their water?
Sure. I think most folks are worried about it entering the groundwater table. I think that's one, and that's job one for us to make sure that doesn't happen. Fracking has not contaminated fresh groundwater. I mean, the methane issue that we just talked about is a separate and distinct issue. That's not a result of hydraulic fracturing. The chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing have never interfaced with fresh groundwater. So again, those of us that work in this business every day, that's the blocking and tackling in job one, to make sure that never it happens and it gets done in an environmentally responsible fashion. And much of the reason why this coalition that I represent and have the honor of representing is so focused on making sure we have world-class rules in Pennsylvania to make sure it gets done correctly and we protect our environment. The great part of it is that we're now beginning to see some of the downstream opportunities beginning to bud in Pennsylvania as a result of having a world-class energy supply.
Downstream, when you say downstream, you're talking about the end users.
Yeah, the use of that natural gas. It wasn't long ago where almost half of our electrons in our home were being generated through the use of coal. And again, I'm not here to throw stones at any form of energy use, but today about 1 in 3 electrons that come to our home are being produced with natural gas. Few know that we've continued to reduce carbon dioxide emissions at the fact now that we're burning more natural gas in our generation mix. We're at a near 25-year low in CO2, and we'll likely meet the Paris targets because we're burning more natural gas in power generation. Reduced nitrogen oxide, reduced particulate emissions, reduced sulfur dioxide, and what they call volatile organic compounds also have been reduced dramatically because we're using gas in power generation.
That's the drilling process. What about the transport of natural gas and the environmental concerns from whether it be the transport of the water that needs to be treated off-site or the transport of the gas itself?
Okay, so let's start with, we'll stay on the production side. I'll use the term upstream, so that's the production process.
Where the drilling actually happens.
That's actually correct. So I talked about the water that's being used. Maybe a little bit of a further explanation there would be helpful, is that water is a tool to carry sand. Sand serves as a proppant, and proppant is exactly what you think. It holds open the formation. So we use pressure, and you pressurize water and force it into shales, which are fractured, and the water then drives back through the rock. And when that water returns, the sand that's being carried stays in formation and serves to hold that formation open to allow gas to come to the surface. Many folks think that we're drilling into an open cavity and gas comes to the surface. Actually not. We're drilling into solid rock. We're fracturing that rock, and the dead plant and animal matter that have formed hydrocarbons basically then are allowed to be released to the pipe and return to the surface. The question that you ask about water, the water that returns to the surface, and the Marcellus is a really dry formation, so it works much like a sponge, but anywhere from 15 to 20% of that water comes back to the surface. We capture that water. One of the great things that this coalition did over time is that we knew that taking water to public treatment facilities and releasing it to rivers was not an acceptable practice, and that ended. That's a practice that had been used before to basically take metals and different elements out and then release it to water. Actually, today, nearly all of the water today is taken to a treatment facility, metals reduced, and then the water taken back to the next hydraulic fracturing operation, and we reuse that water or recycle that water. It lessens our need for fresh water and eliminates disposal. That's a practice that our industry is working to perfect. In fact, today, we're actually looking to use acid mine drainage water to lessen a problem that exists in our Commonwealth and use those AMD waters or acid mine drainage waters in the hydraulic fracturing process as well.
So you're taking water that is essentially undrinkable, unusable, unswimmable, and using it in a manufacturing process. It will then be treated and actually probably cleaner than it was then when you received it.
Yes, and then use it again and again and again to open up an energy supply that is world-class. We've gone from a period, folks don't have to think too long ago. A decade ago, natural gas prices were record high. We had natural gas prices in Pennsylvania at the wellhead at $13.71 in February of 2008, delivered to your home at $20. Today, that natural gas price is anywhere from 51 to 78% less in cost because of this world-class supply that's been generated over the last 10 years. So again, we've gone from a period of tight supply and high price to a period of abundance and affordability, and I believe this supply is generational. This is going to last a long time. We're very much in the early innings of a long inning game in terms of our energy supply from shales here in the United States.
When you talk about the water that is used for treatment and then it's reused and recycled, at some point there is a waste byproduct of it. What's done with the waste byproduct?
Yeah, so if there's a sludge, that sludge would be dried and taken to a landfill and properly disposed of under tight regulation.
Now that we've explained basically what fracking is and some of the environmental risks, I think, and now we're talking, I think, something that you really want to talk about, and that is the benefits of this. You just touched on that when you talked about the supplies we have and the fact that natural gas has been proven to be cleaner than others. And it's actually helping U.S. policymakers and other environmentalists achieve certain targets that they've already set without thinking of natural gas. Can you describe a little bit about the benefits of what shale gas has enabled not only the United States, but the world to achieve?
So, Tim, you and I are sitting here talking this morning in Pittsburgh, a region that for the last 4 decades we've been writing the obituary for manufacturing. Today, through now the affordability and abundance of a world-class energy resource, we're beginning to witness a manufacturing renaissance created by natural gas. And when folks think of natural gas, they think of heating their home, cooking their food, drying their clothes, heating their hot water. But nearly every single consumer product that we touch today is manufactured with natural gas. All steel, glass, plastics, chemicals, fertilizers for our food, powdered metals, pharmaceutical medications, the medications that we use in our everyday lives. Today, 1 in 3 electrons, being produced by natural gas, it touches our lives in so many ways. And folks think, well, the new Green Deal's out there and we need to be thinking more about wind and solar. Actually, those dilutive sources of power, and again, that's not a criticism, it's just the reality. It takes a lot of wind to create a little bit of electricity. they're intermittent sources and they require baseload fuel like natural gas to back them up. So we're a great partner for renewables. The sun, we're in Pittsburgh, sun doesn't shine here all the time. In fact, it doesn't shine here often. So it's important, though, if we're going to put many of our eggs in that basket, that we have the kind of reliable sources of electricity that can deliver electrons on a 24/7 basis. And without that, it's dangerous. And it's irresponsible for policymakers to think that they can wave a wand and it's going to just happen. I mean, every source, we've talked about the hydraulic fracturing process, every source of energy supply has risk. You start talk about wind, you talk about, 880,000 bat deaths annually, bird kills. In solar, you have, high heat, and it requires rare earth metals to be developed primarily out of China. About 85% of the rare earth metals are developed in China. That puts all those eggs in that basket if we become over-reliant there. Again, not the gun at the renewable side. It's just that there's folks in this new Green Deal mindset that think it's a free lunch, and there's no free lunch. We need to make sure we're producing our energy, all sources of energy, and allow them to compete on the open market so we can deliver power affordably and reasonably priced for consumers across the country.
One thing that I think that a lot of people don't understand when they think about things like electric cars, for instance, that's probably one of the biggest examples is an electric car. People think that's obviously better than fossil fuels. What they don't understand is that when you plug that car into the wall, you're basically going to have three sources of that energy. One might be nuclear, one is probably coal, and one may be natural gas. And as you said earlier, natural gas is taking a bigger share of that. And why that's important is because when you compare natural gas to coal and nuclear, just from an environmental standpoint, it is, as they say, a cleaner source of energy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the savings in CO2, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, particulate emissions. Certainly there are folks that have their pen sharpened or pencil sharpened right now on methane, and we're doing everything we can. We have every incentive in the world at a low gas price to make sure we capture every molecule of the stuff. It's what we sell. So, here at this coalition, we've had a research collaborative. It's a committee that invites and has invited folks in from the outside. We've developed partnership with the Ben Franklin Institute, new technology development. One of the things that's now being used by regulators across the country is called a FLIR camera. It's a tool used to detect methane and emissions of methane. It's being used by our industry, but it's also being used by regulators to inspect our industry. And when folks talk about regulatory compliance, I think I mentioned last year we drilled a little less than, I think it was 780 wells in Pennsylvania, nearly 17,000 inspections on our well location. So when folks say that the industry is really, running without regulation, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I believe that Pennsylvania's shale industry may be the most regulated industry in the Commonwealth today.
Well, there's another point, too. We talked about it being cleaner, more abundant, and more affordable. But it also helps the United States establish, and you have mentioned this in different ways, but America's energy independence. Why is that important?
Yeah, we've become more and more dependent over time on foreign sources of oil until this revolution, shale revolution, really took solid foothold around 2009 or 10. I think the first development of horizontal was in 1998 in the Barnett Shale, 1999 the Barnett in Texas. It was a small field around the Fort Worth area. But the Marcellus has been an eye-opener and game changer, as has the Bakken in North Dakota, as has the Permian in West Texas and New Mexico. Many of those are formations that are liquid rich, primarily in the Permian oil in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and northern West Virginia.
That's natural gas.
It's natural gas in the northern part, but I would tell you the underpressure area of the shales also deliver liquid hydrocarbons, ethane, pentane, butane, isobutane, propane, natural gasolines. Not a lot of oil in this region, but ethane, for instance, is the primary feedstock for plastics manufacturing. And we have today an enormous plant being built, a petrochemical facility being built about 20 miles or 30 miles to the west of Pittsburgh. It's being developed by Shale Petrochemical Division to take ethane, and you ionize or steam ionize ethane, ultimately forms plastics. The bulk of that development in the past has been done in the Gulf Coast states. This facility will be the first of its kind in the northern part of the country to produce all kinds of plastic parts, plastic pieces that will be game-changing for, I believe, our region and our country.
Before we talked and I introduced this episode, I talked about the Rust Belt. I talked about the Pittsburgh region. Actually, I talked about some things that I observed over the years myself, being a person from this region, and that is the devastating effect that the decline of the United States steel industry and the automotive industries had, not only on the economy, because that's an academic term, but on families, on individuals, on people that couldn't pay their bills, they couldn't make their mortgages. We saw bank foreclosures, we saw a population decline, and we saw small, once thriving towns turn into ghost towns and just really decay. Now we have the emergence of something like shale gas. As you mentioned, the time frame, it comes about in the years 2008 and since. Can you describe a little bit about the job benefits and also the local economic benefits of shale gas on the communities?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question, Tim, and we've got such disparity because we've got the opportunity to take a look at a state like New York and look at the northern tier of Pennsylvania. We've got a world-class dry gas, and I'll use the term dry gas. That's the gas that comes into your home like you use when you're cooking. It's, you turn the burner on and you see the blue flame. So the northern part of Pennsylvania is a dry gas play. Politics has come into play in a big way in New York, and they put a moratorium about 9 years ago in place in New York State. And on top of that, activist policies have really slowed pipeline development into a region. So as a result, in the southern tier of New York, where there was certainly rock capable of producing, again, continued development of a world-class natural gas resource that are off limits for development. We go into Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, and the investments being made in that area, or in Bradford County, Pennsylvania, or Tioga County, Pennsylvania, have been transformative for those communities. I'll use a number of those communities in the northern tier now have natural gas in their communities where they didn't have natural gas before. The rising tide has lifted a lot of economic boats in those communities, and you see it because you see new trucks and barns with new roofs. In Pennsylvania, we've seen significant growth in family farms, where New York has seen decline in family farms. And again, it's made possible by the $2.7 billion annually that's being invested through royalty revenue for landowners in Pennsylvania. It's been game-changing and transformative for those communities. Shale gas has also reduced, as I talked about a few moments ago, has reduced gas bills for consumers because of affordability, but that's on average about $1,300 back in the pockets of end-use consumers, residential consumers of natural gas. And again, it's labor rates across the U.S. in manufacturing have always been a little higher than other countries, and we've watched as a result of that, we've lost some manufacturers overseas. Today, now with a world-class affordable energy supply, we're able to reshore some of those manufacturers back to the United States, and I think back to Pennsylvania if we play our cards correctly, because this supply is a long-term supply. The affordability is assured long-term because of that supply. I think it's game-changing. I grew up in central Pennsylvania. I watched nearly all my high school class leave town to find a job. Today, we've got the ability through this energy source to develop family wage-sustaining jobs and to keep our kids here at home.
Well, I've seen, too, some of the producers that develop these well pads, they've reinvested in their communities. So we've seen new roads. We've seen improvements to local schools and organizations. So a lot of local communities have come back as a result of this. I have one final question for you. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would tell you that early development, again, as I mentioned at the outset, that we're about 10 years into this development. Much of the early focus was on the upstream or the drilling side of the business. After about 3 or 4 years of development, we knew the infrastructure really needed to be modernized, and we're still on the tail end of that phase of where we really need to get the pipeline infrastructure built. Here in Pennsylvania, I mean, we've got a study that was done not long ago by McKinsey that suggested that if we play our cards right, there's an extra $60 billion of GDP growth projected for Pennsylvania, another 100,000 new jobs projected. And we're going to work to try and make sure we capture that. But I would also tell you that I alluded to that in the last question, Tim, is that how critical pipelines are. Up in New England, we've watched National Grid have consumers, 7,100 consumers in Rhode Island knocked off because of lack of natural gas supply flowing in that area. Again, the New York has blocked pipeline infrastructure. A year ago this month, we saw in Boston Harbor a French vessel loaded with Russian LNG supplementing supplies of energy into New England. It's silly and it needs to change. Those are activist type of policies that need to change broadly for the benefit of American consumers. We're going to continue to do our best to try and to deliver and regasify our communities and grow gasification of communities across the region, underserved areas of the region, but also to use natural gas to power the world and make our globe better than it was when this industry began.
David Spigelmyer, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it.
To learn more about the Marcellus Shale and the Marcellus Shale Coalition, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you could get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group that you can join, a Facebook page you can follow, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.